World War II. It is not likely the world will ever completely heal from its destruction. Perhaps it was for that reason that Operation Cowboy came to be so important to the young, battle-hardened soldiers who risked their lives along with Nazis, prisoners of war, and refugees to save the Lipizzaner horses from the advancing Red Army in the last days of World War II. The Battle of the Bulge left what little remained of the German army scattered in small ragtag groups. Despite the rhetoric playing over the radio that the war was not yet lost, hundreds of German soldiers were giving themselves up to the Allies to escape the Red Army. Most countries shared Germany's fear of Soviet soldiers, whose reputation turned bloodier with each passing day. With the Katyn, Nemmersdorf, and French Arbeitskommando massacres fresh on their mind, they knew no man, woman, or child, whether soldier, civilian, Axis, or Allied, would be safe from their bullets. Every street and road headed west was packed with refugees trying to escape. The Soviet Union was determined to spread as far as they could to the west to add land to their growing communist nation, going as far beyond the Yalta Land Agreement as they could reach before the end of the war. The Soviets took the act of total war to heart, but the Allies were willing to overlook the actions of the Soviets due to their military help. The U.S. 2nd Cavalry was redirected away from Berlin towards Czechoslovakia to stop the Nazis stand in the Alps. This decision, which led to Operation Cowboy, tragically gifted most of Eastern Europe to communism. Soviet biases and animosity would only grow through this mission, subtly changing the stereotypical enemy to a Soviet. And in between it all, the 2nd Cavalry, whose motto was always ready, was in the middle of stealing the most beautiful horses, the Lipizzaner, alongside the Nazis. The Lipizzaner was no ordinary horse. With over 450 years of cultural history, they were priceless in the eyes of Austria and equestrians everywhere. Starting at the invasion of the Moors of the Iberian Peninsula to a representation of the showcase of the absolute power of the Austrian Habsburgs, they went from elite war horses to elite performers. Known as Vienna's white gold, the horses symbolized hope and heritage to the Austrian people during World War II. They often performed to keep up morale and induce nationalism that would give them an edge in war. The stallions were such an essential part of the war effort that even after the bombing of Vienna on September 10, 1945, that nearly destroyed the Spanish riding school, where they trained Lipizzaners in the Baroque art of dressage, Nazis refused to evacuate the stallions. Director of the Spanish riding school, Alois Pahatsky, fought at every step to preserve the Austrian legacy of dressage, which they had painstakingly and patiently instilled in the Lipizzaner since birth. If they stayed, the art of haute école would be lost forever, for the school was the last of its kind. He would later write in his autobiography, "To me, as a rider, the hallowed riding hall meant much the same as a shrine to the faithful." Pahatsky managed to move the stallions to Upper Austria, but the mares were a different story. Gustav Rau, chief equerry of the Nazis, had gathered all of the finest mares the world had to offer in a stud farm in hostile Czechoslovakia to produce the world's best war horse in history, an Orion horse for the Orion race. He was forced to abandon his work in 1944 as the war effort progressed. Since then, the horse stud had acted as a refugee for horses and humans alike. Unfortunately, it also left them at the mercy of the Red Army. The Red Army had already killed the Lipizzaner at the Royal Hungarian Riding School for rations, and the hostile stud farm was next on its list of victims. Every last Lipizzaner mare was at hostile, and if history repeated, the species was facing extinction. The Americans agreed to work alongside the Nazis to rescue the horses, while using the opportunity to obtain secret classified documents and liberate the hundreds of prisoners of war. Operation Cowboy was simple in theory. However, Czechoslovakia had been promised to the Soviet Union during the Yalta Conference, and invading the land would cause diplomatic issues which President Truman wanted to avoid. The woods were full of Deutschland SS, who were politically involved with the Nazi regime and its downfall, which made them suicidal and dangerous. Worst of all, the mares were in foal and were in no condition to ride or walk. Holding down the fort at hostile until the mares could be moved was extremely risky, and half of the Germans wouldn't hesitate to shoot them at the spot, but it was the kind of crazy mission Patton's ghosts were experts in. Everything waited on the response of Colonel Hubert Rudofsky, head of Hostile, to agree to the terms of surrender. The success of the mission relied upon a Nazi who had sworn personally his loyalty to Hitler to openly commit treason. That same day, a German vet by the name of Dr. Rudolf Lessing was brought into headquarters by a scout. Simply stated, the love of horses had transcended the love of nation. Many fragile negotiations followed. Everyone seemed to reach the same conclusion Lessing did. It is no longer a question of winning the war. If we were going to do that, we should have done it 4 years ago. Thus, the operation was launched quickly and secretly, unbeknown to the world at war. Task Force Andrews liberated Hostau and the surrounding satellite stables on April 28th, and they immediately started trucking out prisoners of war. Eastern POWs stayed to help with the horses, since they could not be returned home. And Russian POWs, upon learning that the Americans were arriving, revolted and plundered the horse that they were at, which did not improve the already high biases towards Soviets. At the same time, the 2nd Cavalry was assigned a mission to secure the Einstein Pass into the Alps for the 3rd Army, which only left half of the men under Captain Stewart, who were in charge of protecting Hostau and its inhabitants from the Soviets to the east and the SS to the west. Stewart decided to arm the German and Allied POWs after intensive interrogation and formed Stewart's Foreign Legion, never before seen in the war at this magnitude. However, the patrols were a mere illusion of control until the mares could be moved. German and Cossack POWs saw the horses as their last hope of escaping the Soviet army, viewing their work on the stud farm as a way to integrate themselves with the Americans and earn a ticket out of Hostau when the time arrived for the horses to leave. On May 8th, the war ended officially, but the cloak and dagger operation continued as planned. Now that the Germans were no longer a threat, they focused all of their power on the new enemy, the Soviets. It was precisely this enemy that met them on the morning of May 11th. An American bluff by Colonel Reed, "If you go forward, remember, our guns are still loaded," saved them time, but they were no longer safe. May 14th, the horses were loaded, POWs armed, riders saddled, and they were on the move. It took the large party 2 days to reach Kotzing, Germany, the safe haven. The Lipizzaner and Americans returned home before the year ended. Though it took 18 years for Americans to learn of the operation, the effects of the rescue spread far and wide. It had many short-term effects. The Germans who helped were offered asylum and jobs in America, and Czechoslovakia relations became strained when they accused the veterans of horse thievery and demanded the return of the horses, which the United States argued was rightfully theirs as war trophies. The operation in itself also helped lessen the PTSD of the soldiers involved, as taking care of the horses helped them escape the war for a few moments. These horses represented something unsullied by the degradation of combat and suffering. They were of the world of peace and harmony, living relics of a far saner age. Operation Cowboy was their closing, their last act in the war. What could have been the 21st century Alamo became an unprecedented triumph for all parties. Enemies were united under a common goal and became friends. Hundreds of POWs, refugees, and Sudetenland Germans survived the Russian advance, and they even saved a large group of Cossack Russians who were experiencing their own Holocaust from the Soviets, despite biases against their nationality. They still completed their missions for Diana Hof in the Einstein Pass in the middle of it all, and preserved the culture of Austria. In the long term, the actions of these men not only prevented the extinction of a species, but allowed it to grow from 275 Lipizzaner in 1945 to over 10,700 in present day. Austrian culture also spread to America, where the Spanish riding school had its first performance in the US in 1950, and South Africa, where another riding school opened in Kalami with all-female riders in the 1960s, which recently started the Lipizzaner riding program, spreading opportunity and equestrianism among younger generations.
My life was like no future before, but now I see my future.
To this day, it has aided the Austrian economy through employment and tourism, and has left a legacy of friendship between America, the Czech Republic, and Austria. In fact, Czech citizens and Operation Cowboy veterans get together every 2 years near Hostau to celebrate the mission. It also had its fair share of tragedies. It worsened the U.S. relationships with Soviets and Czechs, and the interactions between the Soviets and Reed showed the world a new dynamic, which was the beginning of the Cold War. The operation wasn't able to save all the horses, having to forego a satellite stud farm and the straying horses due to lack of men during the movement. The Czech Communist government forbade any monument celebrating Operation Cowboy, and soon the rescue faded from memory until they left the Communist government. General Patton never got to see the legacy of Operation Cowboy as he died the next year. The Americans, in the atomic age, never took an interest in the horses brought back from Europe, and the finest racing, performing, and breeding horses were lost to Europe and sold at auctions. There were only 2 casualties, both a triumph and a tragedy: Raymond Mans and Owen Sutton. When asked why they would risk their lives so close to being sent home to save horses, especially when there was so much more going on around them, Colonel Reed replied in a simple and short sentence that grasps the essence of Operation Cowboy: "We were so tired of death and destruction, we wanted to do something beautiful."